Okay, welcome to the Path series. Okay, so this month we are having a look at Wicca. Now, I think it's going to be impossible to kind of cover everything, especially in regards to Wicca. I mean, the history, how it's developed over the years, the branches of it, is just immense. So, what I'm going to do, I'm going to try and give you kind of a basic background and a basic idea and some book recommendations, which you can then go and read, and it explains everything in detail. Now, the difficulty with Wicca is that I suppose we could say two main branches. So there's initiatory Wicca, and then there's neo Wicca or neo paganism. The aspect of neo-paganism kind of branched out of what was being published 80s, 90s with Scott Cunningham, Silver Raven Wolf, and such people. What was being published there was very much Wicca based, and it kind of made it into the mainstream. So it became this neo-pagan or neo-Wiccan movement, really. But you'll find that what kind of developed over the years, over the decades, really, it still holds true very much to what initiatory Wicca is, but it has diverted a lot. I mean, if we were to say, is traditional Wicca monism, dualism, polytheism, animism? Yes, to all of it. You see, the difficulty is that when it started with Gerald Gardner, who kind of went public with it in 1954, it was very much duotheistic, which means that it's kind of a dual deity. So they worship the god and they worship the goddess as two separate entities, obviously. But that dual aspect of opposing forces. Sorry, let me just try and change my screen again. It's gone all bright. Okay, I think that's better. All right. So we have the duotheistic aspect, being the god and the goddess. That later actually got revealed as being Cernunnos and Aradia. And there is a lot of influence from Charles Leland around his book, which kind of revolved around Stragaria witchcraft, came out of Italy. That was Aradia, Gospel of Witches. There was a lot of influence from that. Now, the difficulty with the history of Wicca is that a lot of it is still being explored. A lot of the claims that were made don't really ring true in all aspects. So, in regards to the history, it gets a bit difficult to actually sort out. There's a lot of influence from old witchcraft traditions and covens, but there's a lot of influence from the ceremonial magic side. So Aleister Crowley, Thelema, Golden Dawn, Rosicrucianism, even influences from the Eastern philosophies. We have the raw folk magic aspect in Wicca, in traditional Wicca, let's call it Gardnerian Wicca. But we also have influences from ceremonial magic. When it branched off to Alexandrian Wicca with Alexander's, that became a lot more, or the bias was very much on the ceremonial magic aspect. As I said, you've got all these branches. You've got Raymond Buckland, who created Sioux Wicca, and great book to read, by the way. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to actually recommend two books, and from those you should be able to kind of take the study a bit further, but I'll get to that just now. So that's the duotheistic aspect, the god and the goddess, the dual aspect. Is it monism or even monotheistic? If we look at Dianic Wicca, which was kind of modern Dianic Wicca was said to have been created by Z Budapest. Now Dianic Wicca is very much goddess and female related. It completely and utterly rejects the masculine. Absolutely, completely and utterly. There's men are not allowed in Dianic Wicca covens. There is no god. It is purely focused on the feminine and the goddess, and can sometimes get to the extreme where it's monotheistic. It's just that it's not a masculine god, it's a feminine goddess that's being celebrated. Is it polytheistic? A lot of development that's happened over the years, over the decades, has become polytheistic, as opposed to the duotheistic aspect that it originally was. So, this is why I say it's kind of impossible to give you an entire canvas of what Wicca is and what it covers in all its aspects and all its forms and paths and branches. Now, I have seen over the years, it comes up every now and again, that people say that Wicca is an ancient religion. It's not. It was created in the 1950s with Gerald Gardner, and it developed from there. But there obviously is some ties to older traditions and older folk magic, witchcraft. There's a lot of the practices that come out of that, as with any other tradition or path or magical order of some kind, magical path, spiritual path. It's going to have its roots in older practices, obviously. But is Wicca itself older? There is a bit of confusion that does come in here because the Old English word for witch was witcher or witche. Probably pronouncing that slightly wrong. But the masculine aspect of that, because it's a masculine and feminine word, the masculine aspect of that word is spelled Wicca, which is how we spell Wicca. So it seems to have been some confusion that came in there, relating to a word which just means witch or wise one. But it wasn't actually a religion. It was just a word that described a person. But then Wicca, and Gerald Gardner didn't even call it Wicca. It only became Wicca much later. He did use the word Wicca as in the spelling of Wicca, but not the Wicca as we know it today. And it wasn't the same relation. He called it the craft or the craft of the wise. So Wicca itself, the word, only developed later, and it wasn't even Doreen Valiente as far as I recall. A lot of Wicca, traditional Wicca, initiatory Wicca, and Gardnerian Wicca that we find was, a lot of the material, the initiations, the poetry, the charge of the goddess, and all such things that are very important to the practice of Wicca, actually was created by Doreen Valiente. In conjunction with Gardner, obviously, but a lot of it can be equated to Doreen Valiente. So one of the books I actually want to recommend is Doreen Valiente's book, The Rebirth of Witchcraft. Now, the main reason I like this book is because it goes into the history. Doreen Valiente worked closely with Gerald Gardner, but also worked closely with Robert Cochrane, who, traditional witchcraft came out of that connection with Robert Cochrane or Roy Bowers. So she worked closely with both of them. Now, when we look at um, Gardnerian Wicca versus traditional witchcraft, which came out of Robert Cochrane, there's kind of like an opposition here, almost like opposing forces. And so Doreen Valiente's book, which examines both of them, becomes very interesting because you can see who the men really were that created these traditions. And well, Wicca is actually a religion. And the other reason I like the book so much is that she doesn't kind of put them on a pedestal and worship them. She really has a look at who they really were. Their, all the good things about them, but all of their downfalls. When their egos got a bit too big for their own boots, and what happened during that process. So it really examines it from a fantastic perspective, and just goes through the history, but also goes through a lot of the older history. Has a look at the roots of where the information came from, where the influence of Crowley, for instance, and Charles Leland's book, Aradia, and the older texts as well, and authors who influenced Gardner and the creation of the tradition of Wicca. And also has a look at the old witch cults. There's traditional Wicca or Gardnerian Wicca has a strong influence from Margaret Murray's book. I've forgotten the name now. It's about witch cults. It was kind of discredited. Margaret Murray herself. There's certain things in there which have been discredited, but there's a lot of influence from that actual text, from that book, and from Margaret Murray herself in relation to Wicca, as many others. But Doreen Valiente kind of goes into those old witch cults and examines them. And it really is a fantastic book. It's a great book to actually get hold of and read and find out the actual history of what happened, how things developed, where things went wrong, Another book, you'll find links to all of the books in the description below, by the way. Another book and also YouTube channel is by Thorn Mooney, Traditional Wicca. It's a fantastic book. It kind of gives you an idea of how to look for and join a coven. The approach you should take, the respect you should have. If you get rejected, why? There's a lot of reasons. Sometimes we're just not a fit. And if we're not a fit, then we shouldn't really be in that particular coven or group. Go look for another one. But the respect you should have when approaching a coven, the questions you should ask, because every coven is different. But apart from that, it goes into a lot of the tenets and the practices, the ideologies, the beliefs of Wicca itself. And the other good thing about this book is that the further reading section at the back, the bibliography, has some fantastic books. So after reading the book, you can then go into the bibliography or the further reading section and start picking out those books. Then another author would be Jason Mankey. He has a book called Transformative Witchcraft, which also goes into the history of witchcraft itself. It doesn't examine traditional witchcraft quite extensively or quite as much as I would have liked, but his focus is on Wicca. He actually calls witchcraft Wiccan witchcraft. So, he does have a strong influence in Wicca. He examines Gardner and the evolution there. Goes into a little bit of extra information from the Doreen Valiente book, but goes into things a little bit further, actually. He also has a book Jason Mankey again, also has a book called The Horn God of the Witches, which is a fantastic book. It really is a brilliant book. It examines the Horn God and has a strong focus on Koninos and Pan. And the information that he brings across is absolutely brilliant. It really is. So that's Jason Mankey. Those are those three books: Transformative Witchcraft by Jason Mankey, Traditional Wicca by Thorn Mooney, and I'll also put Thorn's channel, link to her YouTube channel below, because great information. She does a lot of book reviews as well. And The Rebirth of Witchcraft by Doreen Valiente. I mean, other authors you can have a look at, you know, from the older authors. As I said, there's Scott Cunningham, there's Raymond Buckland, The Big Blue Book, or Books, Big Blue Doorstop we used to call it. What was it called? The Book of Witchcraft? I can't remember now, I've forgotten the name. It's a big blue book with, you know, anyway, just look for Raymond Buckland's books. You'll see it. It's actually one of the further reading books in Thorn Mooney's book, so you can pick it up from there. Silver Ravenwolf, you know, in the 90s, Silver Ravenwolf and the early 2000s, Ravenwolf was kind of discredited. She was publishing through Llewellyn, and at the time, Llewellyn's gotten a lot better now, but at the time in the 90s and early 2000s, Llewellyn was that kind of esoteric occult book publishing company that just, it churned out a lot of trash. And it was mostly just to make money, you know. So Ravenwolf kind of published through Llewellyn and churned out a lot of books, but there was a lot of stuff in there which was just awful. And, you know, but at the same time, and I've heard this from, I've sort of seen it, read it, heard it from a lot of people. At that time, there were a lot of people that were in their late teens, and Ravenwolf kind of spoke to them. And this kind of allowed them to develop and to get interested in witchcraft. And, you know, they went further and they examined further, they studied further, and developed from there. But it kind of, I've actually seen somebody said that Ravenwolf's books saved their life as a teen. So, you know, we can discredit somebody as much as we want and say that their information is bad. Still, it was an aid, it was a help. So, you know, if you want to get into Ravenwolf, just bear in mind there's a lot of information in there which needs to be checked and double checked. Yeah, there's other authors like Amber Kay, I would really stay away from. Douglas Monroe, definitely stay away from. Eden McCoy, definitely stay away from. You know, there's some authors that came out of the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s that just would, as I said, were just like churning out books just to make money, and they came out with such rubbish. It was unbelievable. And because we didn't have, I think it's probably because we didn't have the same, there's a lot of people that create a lot of trash now, but we didn't have the internet then, and it wasn't as easy to go and check, you know, really go and check information, unless you knew people who could actually, you could talk to and question, who actually knew their stuff, or you had a well-stocked library or something like that. But nowadays, you know, we've got the internet, we can really delve into and get into the nitty-gritty of things, find information. But at the same time, there is so much information out there, it gets kind of difficult to do it. So I'm not sure if we're in a better or a worse situation, but anyway, I'm kind of going off the topic of Wicca now. So yeah, as far as Wicca is concerned, there is a lot of information to pull out. As I said, from its original inception of it being being duotheistic, to its developments over the generations, the decades, you know, going from Gardnerian to Alexandrian, to Sioux Wicca, to Dianic Wicca, to, you know, well, we'll have a look at the fairy tradition separately, but the fairy tradition has a strong influence from Wicca itself. So, there's all of these different paths, and then going into the Neo-Wicca. Now, that's kind of separating the Neo-Wicca from the traditional or the initiatory Wicca, because the initiatory Wicca has degrees and works within a group in order to initiate us into the various mysteries. Neo-Wicca becomes very solitary, and it's very difficult to delve into the mysteries. It's not impossible, but it does become very difficult because the information you have available to you is only really your base level stuff. In order to delve deeper, you've got to really go and study, and get in contact with the spirits, the land spirits, the gods and the goddesses, which is probably a large reason why it became more, or leaned more towards polytheism. So you have that contact with a variety of different spirits rather than just two or just one. The duotheistic aspect kind of views the god and the goddess, but all gods from all pantheons are this one god, and all goddesses from all pantheons are the one goddess. It has its roots very much in Dion Fortune's statement that was all gods are one goddess, and all goddesses are one goddess, and there is one initiator. Just check that, may have it slightly wrong, paraphrasing here. But yeah, it became this kind of duotheistic thing rather than a polytheistic view. So I think that's where Neo-Wicca kind of went, was that direction of polytheism. But practices and beliefs vary so much that it's kind of impossible to give you an overall or an in-depth kind of perspective on all of them, because there's so many different views and different perspectives, different worldviews. I mean, the afterlife itself is quite often indicated as being this kind of, you die and you go into this waiting period, which is called the Summerlands. Bit like purgatory, really. It's not that kind of idea that you go into this place to get rid of your sins or anything like that, but it's this waiting period before you get reborn. Some Wiccans don't believe in reincarnation. Some Wiccans don't believe in practicing magic. Some Wiccans don't believe in the worship of deities at all. So, I think you can see that it becomes so diverse that just to explore Wicca itself becomes a lifetime thing if you want to try and explore all of it. Alright, so before I start confusing everybody even more, I'm going to leave it there. There's a lot I have not mentioned, but there's a lot you can go and discover. I think the 3 books that I've recommended are a very, very good start if you want to go down this path and really have a look at what's going on regarding beliefs, practices, and the difference between Neo-Wicca and initiatory Wicca. Alright, so I'm going to leave it there. Have a good one, and I'll see you next week. Cheers for now. Bye-bye.